Hello and welcome to the EcoTeq Academy webinar, Maximising Mowing Efficiency in Spring. Today I'm joined by Tony Miller, EcoTeq Outdoor Product Specialist, who has worked with many councils and contractors for years and has built an impressive wealth of knowledge. He has seen and experienced firsthand many of the challenges that we face in this industry and would love to pass on some of his knowledge. We will be answering questions at the end of this webinar. Please feel free to post questions in the chat. Thanks again for joining. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Braden, and thank you all for joining today. We thought we'd start off by covering off on some of the challenges we've seen in the industry of recent times. The items such as changes in weather patterns are delaying our mowing schedules. It's seeing many contractors and operators struggling to maintain grass due to the high rainfall and boggy applications. So this is impacting their schedules. Also, on top of that, with the long grass, we're seeing poor presentation. So we understand operators are struggling to get on top of their schedules, which in turn is leaving bad presentation for our cityscapes. And then on top of that, we see operator safety jeopardised in wet conditions, meaning that in some cases they may be operating in uneven grounds or boggy surfaces, slippery conditions. And then also when grass gets to a certain length, that increases pollen and also exhaust fumes. We see diesel and petrol machines struggling in heavy growth, which increases exhaust fumes from the point of view that unburnt fuel is going straight out the exhaust. On top of that, we see operator fatigue, because the operators are doing their best to try and maintain mowing schedules. So they're put under pressure to do long days and get out there and meet their schedules whilst under pressure from their client. The other thing we'd like to point up is that where do we see in these spring mowing conditions? Quite often equipment is left unattended for the off season, and then we come into the heavy season, heavy rain season, heavy growth season, where we've got high rainfall and high humidity, which is a recipe for perfect grass growth. If the machines haven't been maintained correctly or serviced prior to that season, we see lots of other functions and features on the machines that may fail, such as belts and motors, transmissions, etc. So we just thought we'd cover off on that. Braden and I thought it was a good little topic to cover off, and we look forward to your questions at the end.
Thanks very much, Tony. So it does raise a couple of questions. We understand, or we'd like to think we understand, most of the challenges with long wet grass. I guess the first point is, what's your view on the regularity of cuts? How often should we be cutting?
Well, it's a great question, but in spring you should be cutting as often as possible. However, we understand that many local governments and facilities want to maximise their cuts in view of making sure that the cuts, they're getting their bang for their buck, so to speak. So they're getting return on their investment and they're minimising outgoing costs. So we understand that schedules are pushed out. In some states, it's interesting to note, we've seen in Western Australia, for instance, they do double of the cuts that we do on the East Coast, which is an interesting point. Hence the reason that you'll drive the streets of Perth, you see it very nice and tidy. Grass is always well maintained. And where we have grass on the East Coast, we have heavy, long, thick grass with less number of cuts. So hopefully one day when the autonomous mowers are out, which is very soon, that'll help our local governments see that we can cut more often while still maintaining that total cost over the annual period.
Yeah, that's cool. It is an exciting prospect, and it's not too far away, thankfully. But so fortnightly cuts, you believe, is the ideal cycle, but it's obviously not always achievable. What do we do if we can't physically meet that 14-day turnaround?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess what we can do is just put in best practices in place. So we've put together some ideas around best practices for operators, and some of these we're sure you may already be doing. And they can come down to setting up your equipment correctly. So cutting at the right height, making sure the deck and blades are well maintained, ensuring your machine is maintained correctly by the service intervals. Many operator manuals have this in place, so the set number of services that should take place based on your hours. And then keeping your blades sharp. So we've got a little topic on that later, which we'd like to cover off on, maintaining sharp blades. And then choosing the safest time in the day to mow slopes. Obviously, this may not always be a perfect example. However, it's always good to mow later morning on a slope due to the dew fall. And then keeping safe distance from the public. So obviously a lot of operators are operating in parks where there is public pedestrians, and clearly in the heavy growth season, in high spring, high rainfall, grass grows quick, so there's hidden objects such as sticks may have fallen from trees, branches, stones, and other rubbish that may have been thrown into the long grass, which an operator may not see. So we'll cover off of that a bit more.
That's good. So the first point that you've got here is the setting up your equipment correctly. We can delve into that in a little bit more detail. The first point on that is cutting higher. Now, cutting higher is a bit of a contentious issue. Where do you believe people should be cutting, or does it vary grass by grass or area by area? What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a good point. It's how long is a piece of string about how long to cut grass, but a good guide is 2.5 inches in a parkland, or 3 inches. And sometimes you may need to go higher depending on the grass growth. But a lot of folk think that cutting the grass as short as possible means that they won't have to come back as soon. But the theory is, and it's actually a proven fact, the shorter you cut the grass, the faster it's going to grow. You have to find that happy medium.
It's a bit like, I guess if you're shaving in the morning at 5 a.m, by the time you get to 5 p.m, you're looking a bit scrubby. But if you gave it a number 2 or something once a week, you'd actually probably have better presentation throughout the week. I don't know, it's probably a terrible example, but the shorter you cut it, any growth looks terrible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's correct. But it is actually been proven that if you cut close to the bone, so to speak, close to ground level, you are going to have faster grass growth. So you find a 2.5, 3 inch, even might be 3.5 inch cut cycle, and that's going to limit the grass growth a little bit, which means that next time you come on your cycle, it's not going to be so long and so thick.
The other thing it does do is suppresses weeds when the grass is a little bit longer, which obviously helps the presentation as well. Angling the deck forward, Tony, what's the idea behind this?
Yeah, so it's a good point, and it can be overlooked quite easily. So particularly on a rear discharge deck mower, if you angle the deck forward so that the rear is slightly raised, this will help the efficiency and the dispersion of the grass out the rear of the deck. Ideally, having it anywhere from 0.5 inch to 1 inch raised higher than the front of the deck will help that effectiveness and efficiency of getting the grass out the back of the machine. And it also helps in the clumping and clogging. That leads us on to mulching baffles. So most rear discharge mowers come with mulch baffles or mulch blades. Cutting thick grass with mulch baffles will tend to clog them up because they're cutting 3 to 4 times the grass. And so ideally, if you're cutting grass every fortnight or weekly, perfect example to keep your mulch baffles in. But if you're cutting grass on a 3 or 4 week cycle through spring periods, you should actually remove your mulch baffles, because you're potentially just going to clog the machine and leave an untidy present.
Yeah. So I guess the idea of the mulching baffles is to hold the grass in above the blades, so that it gives it another few cuts that comes back down through to really mulch the grass up quite fine. But what you find when the grass is wet and if you've got a high volume, the grass is really sticky and it sits around the inside of this baffle and ends up filling up a lot of that cavity, which means that you don't have any room for the new grass to grow. You'll end up clogging, and then the mower will, if you've got a petrol or a diesel, your mower will stall. If you've got an electric machine, obviously with the override protection, you're likely to be the motor's cutting out. Then you'll leave big clumps of grass everywhere. So it's a good point. Yeah, another good point there with the tyre tread. Most people believe that the tyres, the tread, or the tyres that they come with on the mower, which is generally a turf pattern, is the tyres that, you know, that's what you get, that's what you work with. But we've got a different view on that one.
Yeah, it's good, Braden. So as we've shown in the picture there, there's a few options these days we can offer on mowers. So the turf tyres generally come as standard on mowers. However, of recent years, Michelin have developed the tweel, which is shown in the picture there, the lower tweel. So that's got a number of benefits. Obviously, number one is it's puncture proof. And then number two, it does give more surface area. So it actually suppresses slightly. It takes out undulations out of the ground. So it gives the operator a better ride. Not so much pressure on the operator on his back. It works very well in conjunction with a high quality spring seat. And then if you are working in slopey areas or rough terrain or even slightly muddy terrain, there's the option of putting the tractor type tyre on, which will give you some more tread.
Yeah, so we've seen the V pattern, so your traditional tractor V pattern on these, as well as some of your rougher treads. So there is a lot of options there. That's good. Moving on from there, I just wanted to touch on some of the maintenance points of these machines. One thing I really want to stress is before we come into the spring season, we're kind of running a bit cutting a bit fine now, is get the machines serviced as early as possible. The machines obviously have been sitting around a lot more through winter, have seen a lot less use, and often things may have deteriorated throughout the off season. So you might have had belts going brittle, we might have had fuel sitting around and going off, things like that. But get it checked prior to the season starting, because if you've suddenly put it into 4, 6, 8 weeks of heavy usage without getting the machine properly checked out first, you're liable to have a breakdown, which can be costly as far as time delays. If you've got a mower out in your peak season for 2, 4, 6 weeks, the mower's down, where it could be completely avoidable by getting that service before the peak period starts. Another point as we go through the season, an absolute must is a regular cleaning of the deck. I know most people do it, but it would probably shock a lot of people on the call here. I have seen some decks that honestly don't get cleaned at all. Now there's a few things for this. If you're thinking about the grass build up underneath the deck, as that goes hard and sticks onto the deck, you can imagine the extra amount of friction underneath, so it doesn't allow for efficient dispersion of the grass, and that in turn clogs more grass under the deck, meaning the mower has to work even harder. And when you look at grass on top of the deck, there's a twofold risk. One is if you've got a build-up of grass, you're obviously going to have a build-up of moisture, so you're looking at potential corrosion issues on top of the deck. But if it is drier on top of the deck and you're not cleaning it off, you've obviously got a build-up of heat there with the belts and pulleys and spindles and things, and potential risk for a fire hazard. So it is an absolute must. You must clean the deck at the end of every cut, end of every day. And the third point there, which often gets skipped over because it's seen by operators a bit of a pain in the neck and not always necessary, make sure you've checked through the operator manual. Proper greasing is absolutely critical, not just for lubrication. Obviously, grease does lubricate moving parts, but it also protects against moisture. So it acts as a moisture barrier, which can stop rust building up. So if you've got, say, in your front yokes, in your front wheels, the first thing that wears off is the paint, then it wears off the protective coating, and all you've got underneath that, when you've got that movement, is that grease. So we need to make sure that grease is maintained as a proper moisture barrier. Tony, do you want to go through the machine servicing prior to season starting in a bit more detail, please?
Yep, and that's good, Braden. Thank you. It's quite often overlooked, and it also comes with a cost. So some operators may choose to forego their service, but it is super critical. Some of the things we wanted to point out is making sure you service prior to your season starting, and some of the items and issues we've come across of recent times is fuel degradation and fuel system issues. So some of you may or may not know diesel fuel, if it's left stored in a bulk tank, will grow algae. So if this has taken place, it will immediately clog up your fuel filters and be detrimental to your performance. So it'll create stalling and misfiring. And then obviously if you've got a diesel or petrol machine where it's got a lead acid start battery, quite often these are left through your off season. They can cause you grief if not maintained checked correctly, causing corrosion, even corrosion in the terminals. And then obviously engines and transmissions, if they've been left sitting too long, not turned over and maintained correctly, can cause grief during your startup procedures and start up into that heavy growth cutting. And then obviously, as Braden touched on, if there's grass and material left on the machine for a long period of time, this can cause corrosion to your metal parts and degradation of your belts, rubber, making them brittle. And then it's important to note that obviously you may have used your mower in the last heavy season, it's working overtime, so everything's hot, and then it's left to cool down through the winter. This can cause belts and components to fail due to being brittle and unused for a lengthy period of time. And obviously, always checking your blades and your deck deterioration. So it's a good idea as a regular check anyhow to check your blades weekly or even daily. You never know what they've been subjected to, hitting debris, rocks, etc. And then obviously your electrical system. So even your start cables on a petrol or diesel machine, in some cases we've seen where rodents have eaten into them, causing you grief. So it's great to do a thorough check and service prior to hitting the season.
Thanks, Tony. That's good. One of the things I firmly believe is one of the most important parts of the mower, because it's what actually does the work. I mean, it's not what's driving the mower, that it's the thing that's at the coalface of the mower, I guess, giving us both the presentation and adding wear to the mower is the blades. Sharp blades, I believe, is one of the most important things of looking after your machine, because it puts so much extra load onto the machine if it's not done properly. Now, one thing I will say is in the US and other areas around the world, blades are sharpened about every 20 to every 40 hours. Now, we don't seem to do that too much here in Australia. We seem to mostly just replace the blades, and I believe it's generally down to a risk assessment and the risks of sharpening blades, which is understandable. But what we're finding as a result of it is people trying to push their blades out to 200 to 300 hours sometimes in some cases. And think about it like if you were given a sharp sickle and you were given a baseball bat and you had to cut an acre with both, I can guarantee you'd be more exhausted by the end of cutting a field with a baseball bat than you would be with a sharp sickle, and plus it'll look absolutely horrible. Essentially, it's cutting rather than tearing. If you have a look at this insert image here on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got an image here where the grass is torn with a blunt blade. Now, what that does is the end of the grass ends up drying out because it can't get the moisture to the end of the blade, and it allows for disease to set in. It dries it out, allows for disease. The grass looks terrible, and it can actually affect your grass for many seasons to come if a disease does set in. And then obviously on the other side of the screen, we've got it cut. So essentially it's like, instead of ripping paper, it's cutting paper with a pair of scissors. Other things that you'll notice is you'll have a lot better fuel economy, or if you're using an electric piece of equipment, you have a lot better battery consumption, so you get more hours out of the gear that you're using. That'll be cheaper. And then probably the most expensive part is risks of damage to the engine, to your spindles, belts and other components. What we're seeing is people that really look after their mowers, making sure the blades are correctly sharpened or replaced on a regular interval. Their machines are actually doing between 6,000 and 8,000 hours and they're still in good shape. Whereas a lot of councils we see that try and run their blades out. Now think of a blade as a consumable item, and they're trying to run the blades out as long as possible, sometimes 250 to 300 hours. And for the sake of extending the life of a consumable component, they're destroying the life of their mower. So they're only getting 1,500 hours to 2,000 hours out of the mower, which is 4 times shorter than some people are getting out of it. And by the end of it, the mower's absolutely flogged. It's just because the mower's had to work so much harder through its life. Again, back to that baseball bat theory. If you are cutting a field with a blunt blade, it's 4 times harder than cutting a field with a sharp blade. The other risk is having split or cracked blades. If you do run them too long, they do get weak points in the blades. We have seen it where you've had pieces of blade come off. Now these blades are spinning at between 15,000 feet per minute and 18,000 feet per minute. So they do come off at a very, very high speed, and it essentially turns into a lethal piece of shrapnel. So we want to be very careful, especially when you're operating in a public space. But anyway, it can be very dangerous to operate blades past their service life. We'd normally expect to be looking at replacing blades on a side or rear discharge about every 100 to every 130 hours is probably optimal. I wouldn't be going too much past that. And then if you're mulching it, because it's cutting it an extra 3 or 4 times more than it would be if it was just cutting and spitting out the back or out the side, that actually does drop the blade life down to about 50 to 80 hours, somewhere in there. The most critical thing is making sure we're checking the blades every week. Check for notches out of it, check for dull edges, and report that back. One tip I would have here is if you're roughly the amount of hours that you're going to be doing over a season, get in early and order enough blades to cover yourself, or at least to get you started in the season, so that you're not sitting there waiting for an extra 2 weeks or wherever you're getting your blades from and trying to extend the life out in the meantime and keep cutting with a set of dull blades. I don't know, Tony, have you got any other thoughts on this?
No, that's good. It's a good guide. Obviously, we've seen operators go out further than that, and it depends on what they're cutting and what rocks they're hitting, etc. As an example, I had a guy the other day complaining that his mower wasn't cutting like it was when it was new, and we discovered that he'd done 280 hours on his blade. So he wasn't actually cutting the grass, he was tearing it, as you have illustrated there. So it is a very important factor. It's important from the presentation point of view, but it's also very important not putting extra load, unnecessary load on the machine, whether it's petrol, diesel, electric, whatever it may be. You're putting extra load on the machine, and you've got to just face it that the blades are a consumable item. Whether you sharpen them or whether you replace them, they're a consumable item, and that's what does the work.
That's good. Appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, you were going to speak about the, and I didn't put it on here, Tony, you wanted to speak about the cylinder mowers you mentioned earlier.
Yes. Yeah, we were talking about that earlier, weren't we? So many on this call may know the cylinder mowers that they use for golf courses or cricket pitches, and they cut the grass with a bed knife and a reel. And to set them up, you've done your backlashing, you set them up so they'll cut through paper. And this is so that you do the exact same principle as illustrated. You're actually cutting the blade of grass, leaves a nicer finish, and it prevents disease getting into that blade of grass. So it's just obviously you can't do that with a rotary mower, but the point is sharp blades mean a nice finish and a well-maintained piece of equipment.
That's good. Thanks, Tony. Moving on to the reducing hazards while mowing. It is an important point. Can you run us through this one, please?
Yep, so that's good. Obviously, we all know there is hazards that are around mowing, and one of the main hazards is mowing on wet slopes. So it's very important to understand what the rating is, the slope rating on your mower. Most zero-turn diesel or petrol mowers are rated to 15 degrees. And then obviously some of your higher end commercial electric mowers are rated to 20-degree slopes. So they give you a higher slope rating. And the best practice, as we've illustrated on this little table to the right of the screen, the zero turn is to go across a field, turn up into the field, and then turn back across the field again. This is best practice because zero turn mowers generally have the weight at the rear of the machine, whether it be a petrol diesel engine or a battery pack. And then obviously to the right of that illustration, it's a four-wheel drive. So if you've got a four-wheel drive mower, that's generally the practice you would follow, is up and down.
Is that due to the fact that with a four-wheel drive mower, you've got a higher centre of gravity, so you don't want to be travelling across a slope, and you've also got, actual steering wheels rather than just skid steer, and you've got four-wheel braking rather than just the two wheels at the back.
Yeah, it's a good point. So as you say, it's higher centre of gravity. You've got a transmission that's driving your front wheels for a four-wheel drive mower, so it is a high centre of gravity. And then a lot might be asking the question, well, why is the commercial electric different to the diesel or petrol? That's because, once again, the electric has a very low centre of gravity, which means it's more stable on the slopes.
That's good. Cool. You had this point for reducing hazards in long grass as well, Tony.
Yeah, actually just covering off on that point, cutting near water or lakes or ponds or retaining walls. What we recommend is you carry out your own due diligence, carry out your own risk assessment. And as most would know, the international standard is if you're cutting under a lot of trees and you need to lower your ROPS bar, it's important not to wear your seatbelt. This is an international standard where if you've got your ROPS up, in the up position, you should always wear your seatbelt. However, you need to take that initiative and do your own risk assessment. If you're going to slide or you've got a risk of sliding into a lake, you should always have a plan in place to get up that machine.
Yeah, because mowers don't float, right?
Correct.
It's not a hovercraft, although it's got spinning blades. Cool. Yeah, sorry, the long grass. Yeah, I missed that point. It's good.
That's good. I guess working on slopes at the top end of your rating of the machine, the manufacturer's rating, it's good to, if you've got the time and you're able to check out the path or where you're going to mow, because there's debris or sticks and rubbish. If you're doing roadside mowing, there's a lot of bottles, etc. You can see. If you do that, if you do the walk first, you're potentially preventing yourself from running into hazards of doing damage to the machine or harm to the pedestrians or nearby personnel. And then it's also great in long grass, whether it be a slope or a flat surface, if the grass is long and the mower is struggling, whatever it may be, whether it may be a internal combustion engine or a battery machine, it's great to be able to do a double pass. If you do a double pass, quite often what we see is you're doing it just as quick. You can mow that area just as fast as you can if you just try and do it in one cut. And then you're putting less load on the machine and you're leaving a much better presented lawn.
It's an interesting point. What a lot of people don't realise is a mower's ideal efficiency, when if you might be trying to cut 6 inches off the top of your grass and you've got a 3-inch deep deck, it's a lot more efficient to cut off the top 3 inches and then cut off the next 3 inches. A mower is designed to take in as much grass as the depth of the deck before it starts overloading. If you think about running across the top of a field and you've got more than the actual thickness of the deck in there, it's going to really start choking it up. So realistically, if you've got a 2-inch deck, take 2 inches off. If you've got a 3-inch deck, take 3 inches off. You'll find it's the fastest, the quickest way to cut grass. It could almost be double the speed. Whereas if you tried to take 6 or 7 inches off in one pass, it is a lot more efficient. But
that's a great point, because I've seen many diesels and powerful diesel mowers stalling in long grass and even burning like unburnt fuel out the exhaust. You can hear the engines labouring this is actually reducing the life of the machine.
Yep.
Having had some experience in diesel engines, it's detrimental to your machine. So if you can do it in double pass, you're far better off.
Yep, that's good. And then finally, keeping a safe distance from public. It may seem obvious. There is obviously through the wetter season, when the grass is longer, there is an increased risk of projectiles. So making sure that you're keeping a safe distance from public. Reduce traction and stability. A lot of these operators like to push the machines as hard as they can. We do know, especially when the grass is wet, you take longer to stop, you take longer to turn. So just being aware of public. One thing I will say is, as the day gets on, the operators are more fatigued, their awareness is more impaired, and it's a lot safer to do your populated areas, your highly public areas, earlier in the morning when the operators are more aware. We've seen it in a number of cases. We've seen operators cutting in public where towards the end of the day and in the start of the day, and almost without fail, every time the operators are a lot fresher at the start of the day and a lot more aware of what's going on. So if you are scheduling mowing or cutting times or whatever it might be, try to schedule the highly populated areas towards the start of the day. Obviously, you've got through, as the machines are labouring more than they would be in a winter environment or autumn, you've got increased noise, you've got increased vibrations. It does wear the operators out a lot quicker. So just a bit of a mental note on that. Try and cut the populated areas earlier in the morning and just be aware of who's around. So, Tony, have you got any more comments on this point?
No, I think it's good. We've covered off most of it, but I think just to recap, it's critical to mow in those built-up areas as safely as possible, because you just never know what's around, what's underlying the grass. So, yeah, we look forward to any questions that may come forward, and I'd like to thank everyone for listening through.
Sorry, we have run a little bit over. It's taken us a little bit longer than we thought, but both very passionate about the mowing side of things, and would love to be able to help as many people as possible. So if you do have questions, let us know. We will try and get to all of them. There's only 2 on the chat so far, Tony, so I'll read them out. We've got Robert Powell. Hi, in some places in Europe, such as Amsterdam, they have a no-mow May to leave lots of flowers for insects and birds. This means very long grasses and plants to cut at the end of this period. If we did this here, say in November, how do you think we could mow it? So I guess what he's saying is, if we leave it for an extra month, how do you think we'd best cope with it? What's your thoughts on this?
That's a good question. My thought would be to analyse whether you need to swap to a flail mower. Flail mower will be able to handle that heavier growth a lot better.
Yep.
And they don't leave a bad cut, depending on how they're set up. Alternatively, do 2 or 3 passes to get on top of it. Yeah,
it's a good point. The other thing I'd question is, obviously in Amsterdam and a lot of places in Europe, you've got a lot more population in a lot tighter space. Amsterdam, there is a lot of flowers. You see the Dutch auctions, and they have massive flower markets. Whereas in Australia, I think we've got a lot more open space for insects and birds as well. So making sure that we're staying on top of the high presentation areas is probably not going to be a big deal. If we can stay on top of that throughout November, maybe designating specific areas for the insects and birds. But back to your point, Tony, if it is heavier, really heavy growth and there's no other way around it, a flail mower would do the job. It's a similar question to the next one, in a way. What can we do if there's only allowed a limited number of cuts per annum, but we need a good level of presentation? So that would come back again to selecting the right equipment, would it?
Yeah, I think so. Selecting the right equipment and obviously putting in place the best practices to minimise the time spent. So, as we said earlier, sometimes one pass, cutting 6 inches of grass off in one hit, is not actually fast. You're actually slowing yourself down. So sometimes a multiple cut of a particular area will be just as effective and efficient as one pass.
That's good. Another question from Daniel. Do you have any information on autonomous mowers? Are there any companies working on mowers for the commercial market? Seen smaller ones that could suit residential or smaller properties, but nothing to do larger areas. We do have some information on that, Tony. Over to you,
So
sir.
yeah, we're excited to say that it is coming. We expect to see something in the commercial space, in the electric commercial space next year, 2025. It's not far away. Been doing a lot of discussions with our suppliers, so that is in the wind and it's not too far away. It's very exciting. So I was doing some numbers this morning. It's a huge cost saving, not only from the battery point of view, less fuel, but also that labour. I was speaking to some guys in the States earlier today, and they said they had an airport where they had 4 operators to maintain that airport. They've been able to reduce it to 1 with autonomous mower, so
Wow.
which means they can do more cuts. They can send those other 3 guys out to other sites. It's empowering the operators, so it's great.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we've got one more. What will be the width of cut on an autonomous mower? I think the only one that they've got available is a 52 and a 60-inch at the moment. Is that right, Tony? Is what they're working on?
Yeah. There is a 72 in diesel, but there's a 52 and a 60-inch coming in electric.
Yep.
Commercial space.
Yep. Nathan, on that point, if you do have any other questions, feel free to reach out. Our details are shown on the screen. Please feel free to scan the QR code to leave any other feedback, and watch out for the next webinar. We hope you find them enjoyable and informative. Appreciate it. Thanks all for joining.
Thank you.